The truck showed up before 7. I was already sitting in the cab of my uncle's F250, at the end of the lane, a cup of gas station coffee going cold in my hand, watching them turn off County Road J one after another. A white panel van with a Wausau greenhouse logo on the door, then a flatbed, then a dented blue pickup I recognized from 2 counties over. They parked along the gravel in a loose line, engines ticking in the cold April air, and their drivers stood in small groups with their hands in their jacket pockets, breath clouding, waiting. I didn't get out yet. There's a thing that happens when you've been holding your breath for 6 months. You don't exhale all at once. You sit with it a little longer just to make sure it's real. The foreclosure notice was dated April 9th. I had looked at that date so many times over the winter that I could see it when I closed my eyes. The county seal, the cramped serif font, the way the paper had gone soft at the fold from being opened and refolded in the dark of the kitchen at 2 in the morning. $74,200 remaining on the mortgage. 214 acres on County Road J, Marathon County, Wisconsin. My uncle's whole life condensed to a number and a deadline. I thought about him then, the way I still do, not the last months, but the version of him I keep. The particular way he'd climb down from the tractor cab in one motion, like a man who'd done it 10,000 times. The smell of diesel and silage and coffee that lived in his barn coat. I thought about the other morning, a different October, the cold just starting to bite. The feed mill manager had driven out in a company pickup, mid-morning, gray sky, geese moving somewhere far overhead in that flat November approaching way. He was not a cruel man. He was a practical one, which sometimes amounts to the same thing. He walked the base of the main silo, the one with the lean that had always worried my uncle, and he looked up at the patched seam where the roof had been leaking since August. He pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves and took a small sample from the base where the silage had run black and wet, and he looked at it for a moment without expression. 40 tons, I told him, give or take. He peeled the glove off and dropped it in a bag. He didn't look at me when he said it. Total loss, he said, not worth $1. You'll want to have it hauled and tipped. Then he wrote something on a clipboard, tore off a yellow copy for me, and drove back down the lane without stopping. I stood there in the cold, with the paper in my hand, looking at the silo, looking at the ground where the black silage had run out and dried in the gravel. 40 tons. I thought, there has to be something. The manager's name was on the clipboard he'd handed me, printed on the form in that standardized way that makes official disappointment feel tidier than it is. I don't use it here. It doesn't matter. What matters is that he came back. I hadn't expected that. He called 2 days later and asked if he could walk the pile properly, not just the base. I said yes, because I didn't know enough yet to say no to anything. He arrived just before 8 on a Tuesday morning, the grass still white along the lane, and he brought a second man with him, younger, carrying a clipboard of his own. They wore the same nitrile gloves. They went up the service ladder on the silo's south face and looked down into what was left, and I stood below them watching the clouds move. When they came down, he said, "Your uncle was a good farmer in his time." He said it gently, which is how I knew it was a preface to something hard. He said the silage had been compromised since at least July, that the roof seam had probably been failing longer than August, that 40 tons. And he used that number like he was being generous, like maybe it was closer to 38. 40 tons of silage at this stage of spoilage had no recovery path he was aware of. He said she should talk to the bank before the ground froze, because in his experience, the bank preferred that conversation early. He tapped the clipboard. He said, "I'm sorry about your uncle. He was sliding for a few years, though. Anyone in the county could have told you that. He meant it kindly. I believe that still. He stamped the loss form right there in the gravel lot, balanced the clipboard on the hood of his truck. The stamp left a red impression. Total loss. He peeled off the yellow copy and handed it to me the same way he'd done the first time, and this time I looked at it instead of the silo. The numbers were the same: 40 tons, assessed value $0. The date in the corner read October 14th. From the tractor shed about 30 feet to my left, the old farmhand was leaning in the doorway with a coffee cup. He'd been there since the managers arrived. I'd glanced at him once and he'd looked at his boots, which told me enough. He wasn't going to offer a counter-argument. He'd worked this farm for 14 years, and he knew what the silage smelled like, and he knew what that smell meant. I said almost nothing through all of it. I said thank you when the manager handed me the form. I said I'll be in touch when he mentioned the bank, and I think both of us understood that, as a polite dismissal of advice, I had already decided not to take. They drove out. The farmhand finished his coffee and went back to the machine he'd been greasing. The silo stood behind me in the flat morning light, still leaning slightly south. I went inside and found the ledger. The ledger was in the bottom drawer of the roll-top desk in the office off the kitchen. Not locked, just stuck, the wood swollen from years of the window above it being left cracked in the rain. I had to pull the whole drawer out and set it on the floor. It landed with a sound like a dropped book, which it basically was, 3 inches thick. Green cover, the color faded to something closer to gray at the corners. His handwriting on the inside front page, Marathon County Farm Accounts, begun March 1979. I carried it to the kitchen table and left it there while I made coffee. That was a Tuesday night, October 15th. The first 2 nights I did the papers first. Bank statements going back to 2009, feed invoices bundled with rubber bands that snapped when I touched them, a brittle 1991 tax return, folded into thirds and tucked inside a Christmas card envelope for reasons I couldn't guess. I made 3 piles, things the bank would need, things I needed to understand, things I couldn't explain yet. The mortgage balance appeared and reappeared across every year in a way that told me he'd been fighting it slowly, steadily, the whole time I'd known him. $74,200 as of August. I wrote that number on a paper towel because I didn't have a notebook. I still have it somewhere. The ledger I saved. A superstition, maybe, or just exhaustion management. Wednesday night, I went through the invoices again. Thursday, I opened it. He wrote in soft pencil, numbers first, always, then a note in the margin if something surprised him. Feed costs, milk prices, equipment repair, co-op fees. The pages had the texture of something that had been damp and dried more than once. I read slowly. Page 12. Lost 6 gallons per day in August heat. Check cooling coil. Page 31. Good corn year. Silage sweet. No loss. Page 44. Roof on main silo needs patching. Quote from Halverson. $800. Too high. I turned to page 47, and the sentence was just there, like he'd been waiting. Sour silage pressed wet. Greenhouses pay. Ask Dirksen County Coop, 1987. I read it 4 times. The handwriting was the same as every other line, unhurried, written like a note to himself he was certain he'd remember to follow up on. He never had, as far as I could tell. There was no follow-up entry, no invoice, no co-op receipt. Just the sentence, alone in the margin beside a hay cost from what looked like late November. I didn't sleep. I sat with the ledger open in front of me until the kitchen windows went gray, then pale blue. than the color of the frost on the truck windshield outside. I pulled on my coat without changing clothes. The county library opened at 9 o'clock. I was in the parking lot at 8:40, engine running, hands wrapped around a travel mug that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. I needed to know if Dirksen County Coop had left any record of 1987. The librarian was a small woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she didn't ask me what I was looking for. She just pointed at the microfilm cabinet when I mentioned county cooperative records and told me the machine was in the back corner, behind the periodicals. The heat was just coming up in the building, and the radiators were ticking, and I could still feel the cold in my fingers when I threaded the first reel. Dirksen County Cooperative Extension, records 1984 to 1991. Agricultural bulletins, meeting minutes, field trial reports. The microfilm moved slow under my thumb control, and I read every heading. November 1987, I found it. A one-page internal field note titled Fermented Silage Leachate as Seedling Amendment. Preliminary Observations. Autumn 1987, 3 paragraphs. No author listed. The language was plain as a fence post. High nitrogen liquid byproduct, expressed from over-fermented corn silage under mechanical pressure, showed accelerated germination rates and early-stage root mass in greenhouse trials. The trials had been run twice, on tomato and pepper seedlings. Both showed the same result. The note ended with a line that said, the practice was not being advanced to commercial recommendation due to odor, handling complexity, and competition from incoming synthetic products. I photographed it with my phone, twice, to make sure it was readable. The extension agent was a different matter. I found the current number for the Dirksen County office through the library's reference desk, and I called from the parking lot, engine running again at 11:15 in the morning. A man answered. He sounded like he was eating a late breakfast or an early lunch. I told him what I'd found on the microfilm and what I was sitting on. 40 tons, Marathon County, October silage gone sour. He was quiet for a moment. Not dismissive, exactly. More like someone deciding whether to spend the time. He said the practice was real, but that he hadn't heard of anyone running it commercially in 20 years. The synthetics had priced it out. He wasn't sure the economics worked anymore, but he had the ratios from memory, or close to it. He'd written his graduate thesis on anaerobic fermentation byproducts, he said, as though this surprised even him. He talked for 12 minutes. I wrote everything down in the margin of the only paper I had on the passenger seat. The foreclosure notice, the one dated April 9th. Fermentation period, 45 to 60 days in sealed anaerobic conditions. Temperature, ideally above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant I needed the drums inside, not in an unheated outbuilding. Press pressure, high, sustained. He recommended a minimum of 15 tons of applied force, which is not a hand tool. Liquid yield per ton of input, variable, roughly 8 to 12 gallons if the silage had already reached secondary fermentation. 40 tons. At 10 gallons a ton, that was 400 gallons of liquid, more or less. I folded the foreclosure notice and put it in my coat pocket. 400 gallons had to be worth something. It had to be. 400 gallons had to be worth something. That number sat with me all the way home, through the dark stretch of County Road J, where the gravel goes soft near the culvert, and your headlights catch nothing but frost heave and bare corn stubble on either side. I had $260 in my checking account when I woke up the next morning. I know that figure the way I know my own birthday. The mortgage balance was $74,200. The foreclosure date was April 9th. I wrote those 3 numbers on the inside cover of my uncle's ledger, and looked at them for a long time before I made coffee. There's a farm auction clearing lot outside Merrill, about 22 miles north on Highway 51, that sells salvage equipment the way some people sell furniture at a yard sale. No order, no signage worth reading, everything rusting at its own pace in a gravel field off a county road. I'd passed it a dozen times and never stopped. I stopped on the second Saturday of November. The hydraulic fruit press was near the back, half covered by a tarp that had given up on one corner. It was a commercial-grade unit, old enough to have been built when things were made to last. Cast iron frame, a cylinder that still had its seals, hoses that looked cracked but weren't split. Beside it, loose on the ground, like someone had left them there after a thought they didn't finish, 3 lengths of salvaged angle iron, a section of heavy gauge expanded steel, 4 bolts as thick as my thumb. The man running the lot wanted 400. I had 260. We agreed on $340, which left me with 20. I made 2 trips. The press went in the truck bed on the first run, the steel in the second. The old farmhand was out by the machine shed when I pulled back in the second time, and he helped me wrestle the press frame off the truck without saying anything. He's like that. He'll help before he'll ask. We set it on the concrete floor of the old milk house, which still held heat from the previous dairy operation, and I stood there looking at it for a moment, at the pile of angle iron, at the drums already lined against the far wall. Then I told him what I was building. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the press and looked at the drums and looked at me. He didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He just nodded once, slow, the way a man nods when he's decided not to say the thing he's thinking. And then he walked back to the tractor shed. He didn't come back out until I called him in for supper. And even then he sat quiet at the table and ate looking at his plate. November came in that week like it meant it. Cold that had weight to it. The kind that makes every task outside take twice as long, and everything inside feel smaller than it is. I had $20 and a pile of steel. I started with what I had. The first weld I ever laid down was on a piece of scrap iron in my uncle's equipment shed the summer I was 17, and it was ugly, lumpy, porous, the kind of bead that a real welder would grind off and redo without discussion. But it held. That was what my uncle said when he saw it. It held. I think about that a lot, looking back. He never praised the appearance of a thing, only whether it did what it was supposed to do. The rig took 3 weeks to build, and it was ugly the whole time. I worked mornings first, when the milk house still had some carryover warmth in the concrete. The angle iron framing went up in the first 4 days, a low, squat rectangle about 4 feet high and 6 feet wide, bolted and welded to a salvage steel base plate I'd pulled off a scrapped bale elevator at the auction lot. The hydraulic press came next, a cast iron fruit press I'd bought for $48 from the same lot, its ram cracked at the collar, but repairable with a sleeve and 2 hose clamps. I sourced from the hardware store in Rib Mountain. $12. Everything was $12 or less, or already in the barn, or coaxed out of some other piece of dying equipment. The drums went up against the south wall in a row. 12 of them, 55 gallons each, all pulled from various corners of the property where my uncle had stored diesel or feed supplement, or God knows what. I wire brushed each one clean, sealed the seams with silicone, and fitted a scavenged pressure relief valve on every lid. The valves came from an old gravity irrigation system I found, collapsed behind the woodlot. Nothing was purchased new. Nothing could be. The silage smelled catastrophic. That's the only word for it. When I opened the silo access that first day to begin shoveling loads into the drums, the old farmhand was in the equipment shed maybe 40 feet away, and he stopped what he was doing and looked up. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The cold helped, at least, kept the worst of it from spreading too far. But in the milk house, working close to the drums as I ladled the wet mass in and tamped it down, it was something you had to decide to tolerate. I decided. 12 days in, I slipped a wrench off a half-turned fitting on the press frame and took the thumbnail off my left hand, clean down to the quick. I wrapped it with electrical tape over a strip of paper towel and kept going. There wasn't a reason not to. It was sometime around the beginning of the third week that I noticed he'd started coming to the barn doorway in the mornings. He'd stand there with a coffee mug held in both hands, looking at the rig, not offering anything, not asking anything, just watching. He never stepped inside, but he stopped staying away. That was something. At the time, it felt like more than I'd expected. The first press run happened on a Tuesday, the last week of November. I remember the date because the night before, the temperature dropped to 11 degrees, and I had to run a heat lamp into the milk house to keep the drums from freezing solid. I slept 2 hours. By 5 in the morning, I was in there with the lamp humming orange beside me, checking seals, checking pressure on the frame, listening to the whole rig creak in the cold, the way new things do before they settle into themselves. When the press finally ran, it moved slow. The hydraulic cylinder I'd salvaged from the fruit press lot had a small weep in the seal, and I'd packed it with grease twice already, and it still wept a little. But it moved, and the silage mass compressed, and what came out the bottom drain was dark. Very dark, almost black in the first light coming through the milk house window. It smelled the way fermented silage smells, and also like something deeper underneath that, mineral, almost earthy, the way soil smells after a long rain when you turn it. Sharp at the top of your sinuses. I stood there and watched it pool in the catch basin and felt something close to relief, which surprised me because I hadn't known I was carrying so much doubt about whether it would come out at all. 62 gallons by the end of that run. I measured it in the catch basin and measured it again. I had 8-quart mason jars I'd washed and dried. I filled them one at a time, standing at the basin with a ladle, and I labeled each one the way my uncle labeled everything in the barn: black marker, neat block letters, nothing extra, product lot, date, source. I didn't know what else to write on them, so I wrote just that. Thursday morning, I drove the 18 miles to Wausau in freezing rain. The jars rode in a cardboard flat in the passenger footwell, and every time I braked on the county road, I could hear them shift and settle. The wipers beat slow against the ice building on the windshield. The heater in the truck worked on one side only. The greenhouse was on the south edge of town, a long, low complex of connected hoop structures, with a small cinder block office at the loading dock end. The operator met me there. He was a compact man, maybe 60, with the particular stillness of someone who has been polite to a great many people, pitching a great many things. He looked at the flat of jars on the dock between us. He looked at the labels. He listened to me describe the process, the fermentation, the press, the ratios, what my uncle's ledger said about the 1987 cooperative results. And he nodded at intervals the way you nod when you are waiting for the other person to finish so you can let them down without wasting more of either person's time. He had already decided. I could see it in the way he held his hands. I left 2 jars with him anyway. He called me 2 days later. I was at the press when the phone rang, still in my work coat, hands smelling of ferment and rust, the way they smelled every morning by 7 now. He said he'd decided to run a small test. 1 tray, 72 cells, early tomatoes, seeded that same morning. He would set 3 control trays alongside it, identical seed lot, identical soil mix, identical watering. He said this in the measured tone of a man describing a procedure he expected to confirm what he already knew. He was being generous. I understood that. He was giving me a clean result I could take home and stop believing in. I said thank you. I meant it. The drive back was 40 minutes into a rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to be sleet. County Road J was soft at the shoulders, and the truck pulled left the whole way, the way it had since November, when I'd clipped the culvert edge coming home from Wausau in the dark. I didn't have the money to have it looked at. I didn't have the money to have most things looked at. Inside, I sat down at the kitchen table with the ledger and the legal pad I'd been using to track batches, and I did the arithmetic slowly, the way my uncle used to do it. Pencil, not pen, so you could change it. I had pressed 11 of the 40 tons. 11 tons had yielded just under 60 gallons of usable liquid, accounting for waste and the 2 test jars I'd left on the greenhouse dock and the jar I'd broken pulling the flat out of the truck. If the pile held consistent, if the fermentation in the remaining drums was staying even, I had 4 more press runs before the silage degraded past the point where the liquid would be viable. Maybe 4, maybe 3.5. The way things had been going, 4 batches, perhaps 20 more gallons, if I ran the press hard and didn't lose any more to spillage or cracked drums. I wrote the number down and looked at it for a long time in the kitchen light. The old farmhand came in from the barn around supper time, pulling off his cap and standing in the doorway the way he always did, waiting to see whether anything required talking about. I told him the greenhouse operator had agreed to a test. Run. He looked at the ledger page and the legal pad. He looked at the number I'd circled. He didn't ask what the number meant. He'd been on a dairy farm long enough to know what circled numbers on legal pads usually meant. "How'd it go over there?" he said. Not quite a question. "He took it," I said. The farmhand put his cap back on and went to wash up at the sink. He didn't say anything else. Neither did I. Outside, the rain had made up its mind and was coming down hard now, straight and cold, drumming against the metal roof of the barn where the drums were sealed and still working in the dark. 11 days. I know that number precisely because I counted them, marking each one in the margin of the legal pad the way you mark off bad weather when you're waiting for it to break. On the morning of the 11th day, the phone rang while I was outside checking the drum seals. The old farmhand took it and came to the barn door and said the greenhouse operator was calling. He handed me the phone through the door frame without coming in. The smell had gotten to him by then in ways he didn't complain about, but showed in his face. The operator's voice had changed. I noticed it in the first few seconds. The skepticism was still there, but tamped down under something more careful, more measured. He was a man choosing words the way you choose footing on wet ground. He said the tray I'd left with him was running ahead of the controls, 2 to 3 inches taller across most of the cells. The root structure, when he'd pulled a sample, was visibly denser, more branching, more mass. He'd checked it twice, he said, because he wanted to be sure he wasn't seeing what he wanted to see. I stood in the barn doorway with the phone pressed against my ear and said nothing, which seemed to be the right response, because he kept talking. He asked how much I had. I told him 60 gallons after accounting for the test jars. There was a brief pause. Then he said he'd take all of it. I wrote the number down on the legal pad, the price he named per gallon, the total it came to, and I looked at it for a moment without letting myself feel anything about it yet. Feeling things about numbers before you have the money in hand is a way of spending it twice without getting anything for it. My uncle had said something like that once, and it had stuck. Then he asked about the next batch. I told him I had material for more, considerably more. I didn't say 40 tons, because 40 tons was a number that would change the shape of the conversation in ways I wasn't ready to manage yet. I said I could have another 60 gallons ready within the month if the pressing held up, and that I was working on improving the rig. He said to call him when it was ready. After I hung up, I stood in the barn for a while. The drums were lined against the far wall, sealed tight, still doing their slow work in the cold air. The smell had become almost familiar by then, sour and alive, like something the earth makes when it decides to keep going. The old farmhand was back at the feed bins when I came out. He didn't ask how the call went. He looked at my face and went back to what he was doing, and I picked up the wrench I'd set down and did the same. Word travels through greenhouse country faster than seed catalogs. I hadn't placed a single advertisement, hadn't made a call I didn't have to make. The Wowsow operator had said something to someone, maybe at a supply auction, maybe over coffee. And by the second week of January, I had a message from a greenhouse operation on the north end of Wowsow, and another from a place outside Kronenwetter, and then a handwritten note forwarded through the county co-op from a grower in Stevens Point, 41 miles south on Highway 51, asking whether I was taking new accounts. I was pressing 3 times a week by then. The barn smelled like a vinegar factory, sharp and thick, the kind of smell that gets into your coat and stays there. I didn't notice it anymore unless I walked outside into cold air and came back in. The old farmhand noticed it every single time. He didn't complain. He just pressed his mouth into a line and breathed through it until he adjusted. What he did do, sometime around the 3rd week of January, was start keeping the drum log without my asking. I came in one morning and found the clipboard moved to a nail near the press, dated entries in his cramped handwriting, batch numbers, fill dates, press dates, yield in gallons. I didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. It was just there, and it was right, and we both understood that. The rig held. The bolts I'd retorqued in December held. The hydraulic seals held through temperatures that dropped to 12 below on 2 consecutive nights, which I had not planned for and spent one of those nights worrying about, lying awake listening to the barn creak. In the morning, everything was fine. The silage fermenting in the sealed drums was insulated by its own slow heat, and the press, once it warmed, moved the way it was supposed to move. On January 31st, I wrote a check for $4,800 and addressed it to the bank in Wowsow. Certified mail. I kept the receipt in the front of my uncle's ledger, tucked against page 47, which felt like the right place for it. The balance remaining on the mortgage was still $69,400. That number was still large enough to hollow out your stomach if you looked at it too long, so mostly I didn't look at it. I looked at the drum log instead, at the fill dates and the yield columns, and I did the arithmetic that mattered for the week I was actually in. The Stevens Point grower wrote back within 4 days of my reply. He wanted a trial order, 40 gallons, and he wanted it by mid-February if I could manage it. I looked at the drum log. I looked at the press. I looked at the pile, still substantial, still working. I wrote back and told him mid-February was fine. The feed mill manager drove out on a Wednesday in late February, which I remember because it was the day after I'd run the biggest single press batch so far. 62 gallons in one session, and the barn still smelled like the inside of a fermentation crock when I heard his truck come up the gravel lane. I watched him from the kitchen window first. He sat in the cab for a moment before getting out, which told me something. A man who comes to deliver bad news gets out fast. A man who comes to ask something takes a moment to compose himself. He had a manila envelope and his hat in his hands when I opened the door. He said he'd been hearing things. He said a few greenhouse operators he knew had mentioned my name. He said he wanted to talk about an opportunity, and the word opportunity came out careful and measured, the way a word does when someone has practiced it in the car. I told him to come in out of the cold. He sat at the kitchen table and slid 2 typed pages across to me. I read them straight through without saying anything. The offer was $38,000 for the full process. The drum ratios, the press dimensions, the fermentation schedule, the yield calculations. There was a line about my name on a non-compete. 18 months, Marathon County and 4 surrounding counties. The figure was typed in bold, which I noticed. He talked while I read. He said the mill had relationships with distributors. He said this could scale in ways a single operation on County Road J never could. He said my uncle would have called it a smart deal. I finished reading the second page and set it flat on the table. I thought about my uncle sitting at this same table, writing that sentence in pencil on page 47 of his ledger, and not knowing for certain whether it was worth anything, and writing it down anyway because he was the kind of man who didn't discard a thing he hadn't fully tested. I thanked the manager for driving out in the cold. I told him I appreciated that he'd put it in writing. He waited. I told him I wasn't going to sign. He didn't argue. He asked if I'd think it over. I said I supposed I would think about it from time to time. He picked up his hat from the table. He left the 2 typed pages where they were, maybe thinking I'd reconsider once the cold set back in. I walked him to the door and watched his truck back down the lane, past the farmhand's truck, past the 3 drums I'd left to cure along the south wall of the barn, and out onto County Road J. Then I went back inside. I set my coffee mug on top of the 2 pages and stood at the counter, going over the drum log for the week, which was where my attention was needed. That was the middle of March. I am writing this now in early April, sitting in the cab of my truck with the engine off, watching the lane fill up. There are 4 of them this morning. A white cargo van from a greenhouse operation outside Schofield. A flatbed with a blue cab that I recognize from the standing order placed in February, and 2 I don't know yet, which means either referrals or new inquiries, and either way, I need to go find out. They are lined up along County Road J, like they are waiting for a gate to open, which they are. The foreclosure notice is still pinned above my uncle's desk inside. April 9th. That date has come and gone now, and the account is current, and the bank has said nothing further, because there is nothing further for them to say. The remaining balance is $19,400, and the spring orders cover it, and my lawyer has the numbers in front of her, and by June it will simply be done. I don't think about it much anymore. When I do, I think about it the way you think about weather that has already moved through, a thing that was real and is now past. What I think about instead, most mornings, is page 47, a pencil. A man sitting at this same table in some year I can't picture clearly, writing down a thing he hadn't tested yet, because he was too careful to let an untested thing go unrecorded. He did not know if it was worth anything. He wrote it down anyway. That is the whole of it, and I have turned it over in my mind so many times this winter that I can feel the shape of it without needing the words anymore. The notebook is back in the drawer where I found it. I don't take it out much now. Inside the barn, the farmhand is whistling. I can just hear it through the truck window, thin and tuneless and steady, the same sound he makes when he is settling into work he has decided is worth doing. He made up his mind sometime in February, I think, or maybe earlier, when the first order came back confirmed. He didn't say anything. He just started showing up a half hour earlier in the mornings, and the whistling began around then, and I have not remarked on it, because some things don't need remarking. The van at the front of the lane taps its horn once, lightly, a question rather than a complaint. I get out of the truck. The gravel is still cold underfoot, the mud at the lane's edges just starting to soften in the pale April sun. I walk past the drums along the south wall of the barn, past the pressing rig with its dark-stained frame, to the barn door, and I lift the latch, and I push it open, and I go inside and get back to work.